This is Tony Hendrick with Painting Spirit, and today I'm going to talk about allowing. It might seem like a subject that I've talked about before, because basically all of the subjects I talk about are essentially about allowing. And I'm kind of going to focus on this idea that I know a famous sculptor is quoted as saying, and I'm not going to remember the person's name, so if you happen to know it, you can put it in the comments if you like. But the quote is something to do with finding the sculpture within the stone. And is that something you can do with painting? Obviously, we're not sculpting out of a stone. Although for me, when I was first painting, I painted, or at least professionally, I painted highway bulletins or billboards, and then after doing that for I think about 5 years, I went off to art school and was deciding whether or not I wanted to study sculpture or painting. And I looked at the sculpture department's studio space, which they didn't have any. It's all community space. And I looked at the painting department, and they had studio spaces. So that's what I went with, was sculpture department or painting department. So that was my major, painting. And I looked for ways of getting myself into painting, and I was used to sculpting, and anything that I painted, I just painted from photographs when I worked painting billboards. So that wasn't the kind of work that I wanted to be doing while I was at art school. So I started sculpting, and I remember my teacher coming into my studio space and saying, "What the heck are you doing?" As I was working on a plaster sculpture, and I thought I was in trouble. And he says, "You can't do that in here. Why don't you take it outside?" So he took me to his studio space and grabbed some plaster, pigments, and grabbed some rebar, took me back to campus, shoved the rebar into the ground, and said, "Here, now you can sculpt." And so I proceeded to build this sculpture around this rebar, and it continued to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and other students came by and they asked if they could play around with it too, and it just kept getting bigger until pieces started to fall off, and I took those pieces back into my studio and made several different smaller sculptures out of those pieces that fell off. So this was my way into actually learning how to paint, which my painting became a process of kind of going at it and then allowing myself to find stuff within the painting. It helped me have a more tactile feel towards the painting that I was doing. That's what I liked about sculpture. It was something in front of me that I could actually respond to and feel around with, and today, if you haven't noticed, I'm actually working from a landscape. The reason I'm doing that is because I wanted to kind of give an example. Once I learned how to paint this way, where I was finding basically the sculpture within the painting, I began to, paint from life and use that same approach. So how does this all look when painting? Because it's much different than sculpting. You're not really removing, unless, of course, you're throwing a bunch of paint on and scraping it off. And I did a lot of that, actually, where I would paint away at a painting and maybe get frustrated with it, cut it into little pieces and put it back again. So it was actually very similar to sculpting in that sense. It gave me a sense of how to open up the space within a painting. And really, I think it had a lot to do with this idea of allowing. That there really is, very similar to this quote of the sculptor, finding the sculpture within the painting. There'll be points when you're painting, even if you're painting, especially if you're painting while you're looking at something just doesn't feel right to you. And what I've noticed for myself is the reason it doesn't feel right is not because there's something wrong with it necessarily. It's just you haven't quite gotten to the sculpture within the stone. You haven't found it yet. And once you find it, it's like, oh, that feels right. But it takes a bit of playing around to get to that point. And it can feel like you're not making progress. You get frustrated. It's not making sense, or it's not turning out the way you want it. And that's what I mean by allowing. There was a time when I was doing a painting class, and a student asked me how to accomplish something she was trying to accomplish with her painting. And I walked over and just intuitively grabbed her brush and started to answer her question. And I realized in that moment that I didn't know the answer to her question. And the reason I grabbed her brush is because I had to find it. I had to find what the answer was by actually putting the paint on the canvas and playing around with it and seeing what would happen. And so there's a lot of that going on when I'm painting, and it ultimately gives that feeling of allowing, that opens up the space of the canvas and gives it that kind of fresh feel to it. Sometimes something will happen in a painting and you kind of go with it. It wasn't something you were planning. You know, the whole happy mistakes. Let's see here. Let's put a little tree behind this tree. Little bush or something back there. Starting to really sound like Bob Ross today. So I'm going to just play a little bit here and allow the painting to kind of become something. Just kind of, maybe you're starting to see the water happen. Another thing with allowing is, I don't know if this has much to do with allowing or not, but there'll be ways that you can handle the paint that feels predictable. And if it feels predictable, it's probably pretty boring to look at. So I look for different ways that might not initially, when you put the paint on the canvas, feel intuitively correct. Like I was just trying to get this pop forward, so instead of going side to side with my brushwork, I decided to go up and down with it, and that really brought it forward for my eyes. Well, there's the old timer, and this actually feels pretty good right now. Just want to maybe really find the full painting here. Let's bring some yellows back, maybe even some pure yellows. See what happens with that. That feels good. Maybe really bring that. Oh, there we go. That kind of popped it. And now that yellow over there just seems a little too similar. So I could continue to search around with this painting and find it, maybe kill it. So I'm going to just say that I've discovered the painting within the canvas and leave it as it is and plan to explore a new painting with you tomorrow.